Okay, so we're talking about slothfulness versus discipline. How many of you drop the word slothfulness in your normal conversation? Not very often, but like we've said, some of these words are important because they kind of maintain what they mean. They're hard for like the culture to grab a hold of and then redefine. So here's my classic example. What does marriage mean? And the real answer is it depends on who you ask. Is that true? Right? We or some other folks might say it means one thing, another group might say the other thing. Why? Because it's a word our culture has taken, kind of messed around with the meaning, repackaged it, and then handed it out at will. But when we have a word like slothfulness, it's not a word the culture has really gotten a hold of. So this is what I want you to know. I've kept the word slothfulness. This is the traditional seventh deadly sin. But I'm also going to call it laziness. They are not exactly the same. They're close enough where if you hear both words, I mean the same thing. So let's talk about what I mean and what slothfulness is. I put a quote at the top of your outline there. This comes from the great Alistair Begg. How many of you listen to Mr. Begg? I do too. Thanks, Linda. I was listening to a sermon he gave. This is what he says about slothfulness, and I think this hits the nail on the head. He says, the sloth is the one who is, ready for this, habitually inactive. So I would underline that. He's not talking about you work 6 days a week and then on Sundays after church you go home, you eat a whole bag of Doritos with your feet up on the sofa and watch football until the last game is over. We might want to have a conversation, is that the best use of your time? But that is not the sin of slothfulness. That is being a hard worker who's exhausted and maybe making some poor choices with their time. But slothfulness is habitual. It's a lifestyle defined by and organized around indolence and inactivity. He is the man who consistently makes, I love this, the soft choice. This is the easy choice. Well, if there's an easy way out, I'm taking it. If there's a shortcut, I'm going that way. If there's a way to do it without hard work, I'm choosing that way. So that's, in a nutshell, what slothfulness is all about. I read this week. How many of you have ever run or been a runner in your life before? Okay, so just general rule of thumb, this is not always accurate. It depends on stride length and all those things, but a lot of people would just say about 2,000 steps, give or take, walking is how far in a distance? 1 mile, more or less. Some people have longer strides, some people have shorter. Anybody want to guess what the average American adult, how many steps do they take in a single day? What's the average? Somebody want to guess? Who said 3? Okay, that's the closest. About 3,700. Now, how many of you know these freaks of nature who run 20 miles a day? Some of you know. Okay, so that means you know people that are bringing the average up. And so if there are people like that who exist, what's that? You haven't even got to average, Steve. I love that he's confessing. I have it on my watch. I've done 92.87, but that includes pushing a stroller for a while and going grocery shopping. So don't get the wrong idea. I didn't formally exercise, which is another problem, but we can talk about that offline. So here's the idea. If that is the average, there is kind of a general rule of thumb. A lot of healthcare providers are now saying it. How many steps are they encouraging adults to get? 10,000. Do you see there's a huge discrepancy here? 10,000. Now, this is kind of at the root. These are just little symptoms. They're just little glimpses into this issue that our culture has called laziness or slothfulness. Now, I want to say one last thing, and then I'm going to do the lazy, slothful thing, and we're going to play a video instead of me telling you some information. This is the vice, as we've been talking about. Slothfulness is the vice, and for 1,500 years, this has been the virtue that goes with this vice. And what is this virtue? It is discipline. Some of you may have picked up on this, but it turns out that the root of discipline is also the same as a very common word around here, which is disciple. And so to be a disciple of Jesus, literally in Latin means to be a pupil. That's what this word means. But in Latin, this root word means to be, more or less, a disciplined pupil. Someone who has organized the rhythm of life around learning and committing to things, setting goals, and following through with their commitments. Does that Everybody on the same page? Okay, so I had this big question. What does slothfulness look like? Like, what is it? And I was thinking about Homer Simpson and all these classic characters on TV, and I thought, oh, I know the perfect scene for that. So with no further ado, this is what we actually need to do. We need to pause for a moment before Pat pushes play, and then when it's over, we need to pause because I need to edit this out, or else this video will get blacked out of YouTube for copyright infringement. So, all right. How many of you have seen Wall-E before? How many of you can believe that Wall-E is 15 years old now? There are some things in Wall-E that were awfully prophetic, I might say. What's that? The Stanley-looking cups is just one of them, yeah. Yeah. So here's what I want you to see. How many of you would agree that is pretty much a very precise image of slothfulness to the nth degree? Okay, but I want to focus on one thing because I think it's important. Somebody actually repeated it. What is the last thing she says as the video clip cuts out? I didn't know we had a pool. I think what's going on here is that there is an element of this sin called slothfulness where we begin to be consumed by it, this lifestyle of habitual inactivity where we stop recognizing what's right in front of us because it becomes an idol of how can I be served? How can I cut every corner? How can everything be kind of like served up on a platter to me? And for a split second, she kind of gets her world flipped upside down and around. And what does she say? Everyone's gathered around a pool, and she says, I had no idea we had a pool. So I think in some spiritual sense, the sin of slothfulness is one that to the nth degree makes you, unless you're shaken awake, you don't know that there's another way. You don't know that there's something in front of us. How many of you know that there used to be a world without a cell phone? Some of you know pretty well, right? Well, how did you call one another? One of my youngest memories is that sound, the ka-chunk, chunk, 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 that thing. But it was like very, very young. And so sometimes we have these technologies and these things that we see, and they're these great productive devices. They can be used for great good, and we don't stop. And as we accumulate them, we begin to realize something's wrong in this world, but I can't quite pinpoint what it is. And I would venture to guess that one of the what is it's a lot of little things all piled up, and we never stop to wonder why. So we're going to talk about slothfulness tonight, but I want to circle back to the definition here. I think a couple things. Where's my pen? A couple things that are important. I think slothfulness traditionally is equated to a word that sounds very harsh, but I'm just going to give it to you as it is. It's this word. Slothfulness equates to waste. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of resources. It's a waste of abilities and skills that as Christians we believe God has given to you. And ultimately over time it becomes a waste, and this is very, very hard to say, but it's out of the words of Thomas Aquinas. It's a waste of a life. Why? Because as Christians, we believe that God has equipped us and given us purpose and meaning and mission in the world. He's equipped us to go do stuff. Now, I want to point out one thing, and we're going to talk about it later, but it's here in your outline, and it says a doctrine or a theology of vocation. How many of you know the word vocation? I want to point out one thing as like a small seed planted, and if we have time, we'll go back and we'll water it a little bit. It's this idea. How many of you have read the first few chapters of Genesis before? I don't know if you've ever noticed, but in our culture, we think of work as a curse. And we think that sometimes biblically because what happens when they're thrown out of the garden? Cain and Abel, and what does God say? You're going to toil and toil, and by the sweat of your brow, you're basically barely going to make it, right? And so we remember this because how many of you have toiled and felt like, man, we're barely squeaking by? And so we equate work to a curse. That's what many people call it. But I want to tell you that right there at the very beginning, when God creates Adam and Eve, do you know that God calls them to work before sin enters the world? He calls them to partner with him to do this valuable work, to make human flourishing possible by tending to the garden. God gives them responsibility. Hey, there's these creatures, they're going to need names, right? So before sin enters the world, there is work. And theologically, what does that mean? That at its core, work is good. Yeah. Now, I don't want you to hear this and immediately think my job is good, because how many of you know that there are times where you work a job and you're like, it's not good? That's not 100% what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is reimagining what work means, because God has put you on the earth with a purpose and a meaning. Maybe your work is a side project that you're doing for a time while you're working a job you don't really enjoy. Maybe it's, I'm working a job I don't enjoy, but my work is to minister to the people who are also not enjoying that job and to tell them that there's something greater. So work is a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. And if we think of it as a curse, then we are going to be bound to this idea that the culture wants to sell us slothfulness and laziness as a great cure for hating your job. Okay? So let's get into it a little bit. There's a couple things just to point out. Slothfulness versus leisure. How many of you know slothfulness and leisure are not the same? Leisure, by definition, is more or less enjoying the fruit of your labor. So maybe you're someone who's like, you know what, if we save $50 a week for 9 months, we could take a family vacation. That family vacation, are you going to eat some food that maybe you normally don't eat? I hope so. Are you going to go somewhere more beautiful than your backyard? Some of you have really beautiful backyards, but for most of you, I hope so. This is not slothful. This is not lazy. This is leisure. This is saying, I've worked hard, and the fruit of my labor, I'm going to enjoy it. The second part is very interesting, and I probably don't have time, but slothfulness versus Sabbath. I read this week, that Jews for generations have believed that Sabbath is the cure to slothfulness. And here's why. To Sabbath in the way that God intended, you are called to the mission of God for 6 days. In order to Sabbath as God intended, you have to be working for 6 days. For some generations, that meant in the field planting and harvesting and reaping grain or fruits or whatever it might be. For some, it might be a different vocation. But for Jews, even to this day, to Sabbath as God intended requires that you worked hard for the other 6 days. Maybe that's tending to children. Maybe that's all sorts of things. That makes sense to everyone. So the very idea of Sabbath is the end. I don't want to call it the leisure. It's the spiritual rest. It's the spiritual gift of rest that God gives his people to say, you are allowed to enjoy me and enjoy the fruit of labor. And I want you to enjoy it without any commitment to work outside of just being present with me and others. All right, let's talk about our culture. This is going to get really fun. I was telling Steve beforehand of all the weeks I started reading, and I was very interested and then very depressed at some of the things I read about laziness and slothfulness in our culture. I think I put a quote there. This quote has been making the rounds for at least a year because I saw it a while ago. I'm not sure exactly where it fits, but I feel like it's worth repeating. I looked it up where it actually came from, and it came from a guy I don't know who wrote a book I've never read. So take that with a grain of salt. But he wrote, hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Interesting cycle there, right? And so I think we need to ask ourselves, what times are we in as a large culture? And as followers of Jesus, no matter where we're at in this cycle of hard times and hard men and whatever, blah, 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 wherever we're at, we are called to do something. We are not called to jump into the river of culture and just let it sweep us away. We're called, even in the hardest times, to swim upstream with all of our might. Do you know that? So some of this stuff might be like, wow, dagger to the heart and twisted. That one hurts. Let's let it hurt. Let's let God convict us so that when we walk out of here, we're not people who are just adding to what's normal in our culture. So let's talk about our culture. Our culture is a feelings-based culture. How many of you are scratching your head and saying, our culture is terrible with feelings, right? How many of you would say we are a feelings-based culture? How many of you would say we're terrible with feelings? How many of you would say both can be true at the same time? Okay, there's the right answer. It's always C. Okay, so what does it mean that we're a feelings-based culture? We're the culture of if it feels good, do it. And if it doesn't feel good, then don't do it. How many of you, whether you agree with that or not, recognize that there's something like very simplistic and easy if that's your kind of life strategy? There is something like refreshing of like, oh, well, that's pretty easy. If I feel like doing it, I'm going to. And if I don't, then I'm not going to. So even if we don't believe that, we have to recognize the culture has come up with something crafty and catchy. And by culture, I think I'm intentionally saying the enemy of our souls has come up with this. So let's talk about what it means. I was listening to a podcast a while ago. It was a podcast called The Sean Ryan Show. Has anyone ever heard of that? Okay, Sean Ryan is an I think he was a Navy SEAL. In every episode, he invites very high-level, like commanding officers and special operations in the military. And what I like about it is it's not all like hoorah, military hero stuff. How many of you have heard that stuff? This is a super raw. We're talking some of the most strong, mentally tough people on the planet, talking about things like living with PTSD for 30 years, about suicide and broken families because of what they have seen and done. So it's a very raw, open podcast in that way. But he had a guest on, and he was asking this guest, who is a super high-ranking person, I think in Delta Force, which is one of the most elite of the elite. And he was saying, when you have men under you who have these huge tasks to do, what kind of wisdom or advice would you give normal people? And this is what he said. He said that you need to throw this word in the trash can. He said, this word has got to go. He said, we never once talk about motivation after I tell them I hate motivation. We're not going to do motivation. What we're going to do is discipline. And here's why. Because this word is based on feelings. This word is prone to, if it feels good, do it. And if it doesn't feel good, then I'm not going to do it. This word says, sometimes I really hate working out. Sometimes I'm really sore and I don't want to do it, but the alarm went off and I'm going to do it anyways. Is everybody on board with that? So we are a culture. We're going to talk more about this motivation piece in a bit. If you don't think that we're a feeling-based people, if you don't think we're a tribal people that kind of go along with the flow of what others are doing, check this out. Did you know that when it comes to New Year's resolutions, 23% of people quit within the first week? All right. Okay, so now we got, what is that, 77% of people left? 43% of all will quit or have failed and given up by February 1st, so 1 month. Anybody want to guess the amount of people who set a New Year's resolution and 1 year later are still walking in it? It's more than one. Somewhere between 5 and 9%. Wow. And you guys are surprised, right? Because intuitively, we're like, oh yeah, New Year's resolutions, everyone's doing it. How many of you have been guilty of like on New Year's Eve, somebody brings up, hey, you're going to have a New Year's resolution? You're like, I hadn't thought about it, but now that we're on the subject, yeah, I got one. How many of you also know that's a very bad way to set a goal and achieve it, all right? On the spot, yeah. So discipline will win out over motivation. Motivation is subject to feelings. We'll get into it in a second. We are also the victim culture, and I don't just mean that like in a political way. I mean it in this way, that we are able to identify where we have a disadvantage or we've been wronged. How many of you have ever had this thought? This is an honest thought I've had. Maybe you see like somebody super fit, and you're like, wow, they inherited really good genetics. Anybody? Anybody ever thought that thought before? I've told you this story. It's my favorite story on this front. It's Ray Allen, the basketball player. He was asked in an interview, and he kind of went irate. He almost left the interview because the guy was basically trying to puff him up. Before Stephen Curry broke the three-point record, he was the all-time NBA leader in three-pointers. And they asked him, like, how did you get this form? You were just born with the perfect jump shot. You were, like, made from, like, the Jesus of basketball. In fact, that was his nickname, right? Jesus Shuttlesworth, that's what they called him. And you know what he said? He got really upset. And he said, when you say that on national TV, you tell every young child that they will never shoot a basketball like me. And the truth is, the reason I'm the best shooter is because I shoot more than anyone else. I'm here way before anybody else gets here, and I'm here after they all leave. So instead of, oh, that guy got all the gifts in the world, I could never be like that, why don't we promote a message of, you could be like that, but it's going to take a tremendous amount of discipline. We might want to get started on discipline and quit messing around with motivation all the time. I think there's been an assault on this idea, and I think in some ways rightfully so, because it is just a truth of reality that not every human being starts with the same resources and the same ability to be educated and all sorts of things. That is a true reality. But there's also a difficulty that arises when we stop promoting kind of self-efficacy of like, I'm going to work hard. And even though I might be starting from behind, I'm going to work my way out of it. If we just keep telling people, you're the victim of all these sorts of things, why don't we get really good at pointing out what's wrong with everything instead of just getting to work? We're going to have some cultural issues. How many of you would say we are reaping some of those cultural issues that we have sown? Yes. Here's a couple other things. We're the culture that loves to worship our innovators and the people who created shortcut culture for us. How many of you know who invented the air conditioner? How many of you don't care who invented the air conditioner, but you're very grateful that he did? I think the last name was Carrier, which is a guy who, I think the name is still an air conditioning unit. How about this? I just finished a podcast series about something that happened very near my hometown called the Donner Party. You guys heard of that? How many of you are very grateful that you don't have to travel by wagon train anymore? Amen, she says. From the Midwest, too, so she knows what she's talking about. We're grateful for these things. We're grateful that we can flip on a light bulb at, what time is it now? 6:40 at nighttime, and we could do this. Do you know that in the past centuries, this is very difficult to do, right? But sometimes we don't stop and count the cost of just assuming that everything is going to be easy and handed to us. Let me give you an example. There is a famous church figure. His name is Erasmus. Anybody ever heard of Erasmus? Anybody know what Erasmus is famous for? He's famous for a few things, but he translated the Bible. And you know how you translated the Bible back then? First, you had to read a ton of books and learn from very smart people about Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. And then you had to sit under candlelight while everyone else was sleeping, and you had to, by hand, write it, because this is before a printing press. There's also a figure named Jerome. Both are worth looking up. And they both did the same thing by candlelight. And you might say, oh, man, they would have been so glad if they had had a printing press. How many of you would say they would have been glad? How many of you would think we wouldn't even know who these people are and we wouldn't have their stories of perseverance and hard work had there been a printing press? Right? Or even this. Maybe they learned something. Maybe they were shaped into a certain type of person who was after God's own heart without one. Possible? Here's an honest question. You can raise your hand if you don't. How many of you would say there are parts of your personality that you liked a lot more before a smartphone? Is there? I'm going to shoot you straight. I'm pretty rigorous with my cell phone, but at least once a day, I catch myself taking it, realizing I did not hear what my 5-year-old just said to me, and putting it aside, at least once a day. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. There's something about convenience and ease and shortcuts that are great for us in so many ways, but sometimes we don't count the cost. How about this? I wrote it as the idolatry of toys. I would say this is the part of our culture that loves to accumulate, but leaves the creating to other people, right? This is, someone else will create smartphones. I don't know how they did it, but I sure am glad I get to accumulate them, right? I heard this joke the other day, and I'm like, that's hitting millennials hard, is the phone that your iPhone came in, you don't need it. You can throw it away. Many of you are just stashing all of them for some reason, and it's totally true of millennials. They have a closet full of every Apple product box for some reason. I read this week. This is Father Fulton Sheen. He's a Catholic priest. He said, advertising's goal is to stimulate our sensuous desire, and this is the important part, and convert luxuries into necessities. But it only intensifies our inner misery. So what is the world driving at? It's taking something that was once seen as a luxury and then slowly over time making you feel like if I don't have that, I'm the only one. I'm left out. I can remember this when iPhone came out. When the iPhone first came out, I think I was a freshman in college, maybe a sophomore in college. There was very few people who had that. And it was sort of like, wow, you have that? That's awesome. But in my mind, I thought that's for like elite people. I'll never have something like that, a miniature computer. And then a couple years go by, and then the affordable thing was the iPod Touch that could connect to Wi-Fi internet. Does anyone remember this? And I got one of those, and I'm like, well, it's not an iPhone, but it's still pretty cool. You can like just do little apps and games and things. But then I remember post-college feeling like, I need to make a little bit more money so I can get an iPhone. I'm like the only one in my friend group who doesn't have that, right? It started as this luxury item that only a few people had, and it slowly transformed into if you don't have that, you're a nobody. And that's what our culture does to us. How about this? The ideal American retirement. Here's some things I wrote down that in our culture we think of retirement as if you accumulate enough, you can sail off into the sunset. You can just do whatever you want. How many of you have heard this before, that there is an enormous spike in diagnosable depression among people who retire in the first 24 months of retirement? Why is that? Because there's something important about work. What else, Wanda?
Well, that's what I was going to say, because they're not doing anything. They don't know what to do.
Okay.
They're sitting around.
So if you've bought the lie that you just sail into the sunset, lucky you get to sleep in every day, you get to have Belgian waffles or whatever retired people eat, I don't know. And you get to do whatever you want. You don't have to do anything, no responsibilities. It must be so nice. But in reality, it's the opposite. What are you going to say? You lose your sense of purpose. Yeah. I'll tell you a really cool story that stuck with me for a long time. I met a guy. I was about 25 years old. It was towards the beginning of seminary. I went to seminary from 24 to almost 30. And I met a guy, his name was Ed, and Ed was in his mid-70s. And I met him because he was a new student. He was behind me in the seminary. And he was there, and I remember somebody was trying to like joke with him and said, man, you must feel really old here, right? And he said, I feel pretty old, but not as old as I did when I entered my last program. I said, well, what was the last program? He said, I retired at 65, and I did something I always wanted to do. I went to culinary school. I went to culinary school because I had this vision of something God put on my heart, that I wanted my table to be a place that people looked forward to coming to. And I love to cook, so I decided I'm going to throw myself into it. And I did that, and we started these dinner groups, and they were great. And I realized people have a lot of really heavy questions about God that I'm not equipped to answer. And so I started to pray, and I just thought, I'm going to do that too. And I remember thinking like, whoa, I'm not sure what to make of this. I don't know where this fits like in my brain, but there's something about what he's saying that's ringing like deep, deep in my soul, that whatever he's thinking is something that's good and true and right. Not that everybody should go back to school, but that he has a mission and a purpose beyond whatever his job was. I don't even know what his job was. And I remember that. Because without a lack of purpose and vision and desire, things start to go awry. And this starts to creep in. So, here's what you're going to do. I don't know where you're at on the outline. Mine's a little different than yours. Do you see the chart? It's got some statistics, some observations about laziness and slothfulness. Here's what you're going to do. The question is that as a table, look at that list. Maybe just browse it quietly to yourself, and then turn to each other and talk about what stands out to you most there. And then ask yourself this question: in what area is your greatest temptation to veer towards slothfulness or laziness? I would encourage you, we've been together for over 2 months just in this series alone. Be honest, be forthright, read it. Maybe some of it will make you laugh. That's great. Laughter is a great thing that draws us together. But read that over, and then we will gather and we'll hear 2 or 3 people have to say. Ready, set, go. Okay, I have a confession, and then I want to hear 2 or 3 people. 70% of Americans are serial shopping cart abandoners, which means 7 out of 10 of you are. So who wants to confess? That means you go grocery shopping, you unload the groceries out of your cart, and then you're like, man, I don't want to walk all the way over to put it back where it belongs. No. So here's my confession, actually. This is my honest confession. I drop Colton off at school on Wednesdays because Natalie works on Wednesday mornings. So I went grocery shopping today with Shepard strapped to me, and he was screaming and doesn't want to be strapped. I unloaded the groceries. I pushed the car, I popped the front wheels up over the planter box, and then I left. I went home, put him down for a nap, and I flipped open some tabs on my computer to keep reading, and I was reading, and I'm like, I am the 70%. Okay, I want to hear what you had to say. What stood out to you? Any commentary. You can volunteer yourself or a friend. Somebody want to share? Pat, I'm going to give you the mic, and then you can be the mic runner.
We talked about a lot at our table, but the first thing we opened up with was down near the bottom of the list, second from the bottom, time theft. And we were talking about how we experience this, we see it, where people are sitting around talking instead of working. And then I kind of brought up, what I've seen at my work is we call that team building. And so that's how we kind of get away with it. And then, and then a bunch of people will be kind of goofing off or whatever, or joking, and then the manager will say, well, we are team building, So, anyways, I thought that was interesting.
Collaboration. This job is relational by nature. There's all kinds of excuses. Anyone else? All right, Steve. Give it a try. If it doesn't work, just talk loud.
Okay. Hello. Oh, there we go. Okay. My office has a solid door, which means it doesn't have a window in the door, and it's the only office in the entire building that has that. And so when I'm recording lectures for my online classes, the door's closed because I don't want people disturbing me. But that means it's really easy to, once the recording's done, I can justify, getting online, just checking out whatever's happening on Twitter, and pretty soon an hour's gone by, and I've done absolutely nothing for grading projects or anything else of value, and it just sucks up my time like crazy. So that, let's call it that unaccountability of being hidden, absolutely contributes to this.
I like that. I like you taking ownership, because I think sometimes people like to point out how other people might steal time at work without admitting that they're doing that. Yeah. Anybody else want to share anything? Okay. Do you mind just turning it off, Pat? Okay, let's talk about what the Bible says about slothfulness and laziness. I put two examples there. I'm going to talk to you about the first one, but I do want to encourage you. The second one I think is just maybe like a quick 10, 15-minute little Bible study you could do for yourself. That would be a cool little homework assignment. But let's talk about Proverbs 26. In fact, if you see the Hebrew word for what we translate as slothfulness or laziness on the first page, if you were to type that into a Bible search, you would find that I think almost 2/3 of all the uses of that word come just in Proverbs, which is interesting. So this book of wisdom, in large part, trying to instruct youth. Anybody see slothfulness, laziness, and youth? Anybody have a teenager? Anybody ever been a teenager? Yeah, you can see why would it make its way into Proverbs. But Proverbs 26 says this: the sluggard, which is another way of saying the sloth, says, there is a lion in the road, there is a lion in the streets. Now, that is an interesting thing that a sluggard would say. Why on earth would the slothful person be saying that? What are they doing? They're making excuses, and if there's a lion in the street, what are you definitely not going to do? Go outside. Interesting. So what do? The first words from their mouth are what type of words? An excuse. here are some reasons why I cannot fulfill my commitments, or why I can't work, or why I can't achieve something today. So he says there's a lion in the streets. Verse 14, as the door turns on its hinges, so does the sluggard in his bed. The idea, it's fastened to one place, and the only movement it has is like back, a little uncomfortable, and forth. Back and forth. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish, but it wears him out to bring it back to his own mouth. So you see what's happening here. I think because of the brilliance of the people who are writing what we know as the Holy Scriptures, well, I think what's happened is we've gotten to levels of this slothfulness. The first level is this: I have an excuse for that, right? I have an excuse for that. I'm not going to go outside. It's not because I don't want to. It's because there's a lion outside, and so it's for my own safety and for my own good. I'm not going to do that. How many of you would say, as far as slothfulness goes and the characteristics or the symptoms of, you have made an excuse before? This is like a classic marriage joke, right? I told you I would do it, and so I will do it. And then what do wives say? I asked you to do it 6 months ago, right? Yeah, this is for a reason, right? So you can make excuses. That's kind of the level 1 symptom of slothfulness. What's the level 2? As the door turns on its hinges, so did the sluggard on his bed. So now it's just getting used to I'm just going through the motions. Just going through the motions, accomplishing nothing, doing nothing, stationary, inactive, right? And then what's the final? Literally burying their hand in a dish of food, and so slothful I can't even be tasked to feed myself. So what is it getting at? It's to the point where somebody else will have to feed you because it's too hard of work for you. You see how that is going? So it's extreme. It's extreme on purpose. But it gives us some insight. I want to tell you this, especially about making excuses. Making excuses, I think, is a big one. And I feel like I've been very guilty of this at various times. I've reaped the reward of saying I'm not going to make excuses anymore. I'm going to put myself all into something. I've also had times where I've done that and then failed and then made excuses about why I failed. Anybody have that experience? Yeah. So this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about discipline, because discipline is at the core of what it means to be a disciple. And how many of you want to be a disciple of Jesus? We call them the spiritual disciplines. These are practices or actions that we take: prayer, Bible reading, fasting. These are all sorts of things. We also say that as followers of Jesus, we are opening ourselves up to God the Father disciplining us. And so this is tied up in what it means to follow Jesus. Without discipline, we are not followers of Jesus. So let's talk about what this means. The word in Greek means self-mastery, self-restraint, self-control, continence. This is the word in the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control or discipline. Interesting. I want you to notice one thing. This word has nothing, zip, zero, zilch, that's tied up in emotion. It doesn't say love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and when you feel like it, self-control. Anybody know the song? It doesn't say that. That's not what it says. And so a follower of Jesus who wants to connect to God the Father, how many of you have been doing this a while? How many of you know there are seasons where you're like, man, it's easy. I literally can't wait to get my feet on the floor so I can run downstairs, get my coffee, and open my Bible. I just need more. How many of you have had that season before? Heck yeah. That's a great season to be in. You should love that season. You should thank God for that season. How many of you have been in the season where you're like, I've been doing this day after day. I don't feel like I'm getting anything from it. I reread it 4 times, and I'm like, I don't even know it's there. I just feel like giving up. How many of you have been in that season before? How many of you know that seasons change? How many of you know that if you give up in that season because you don't feel like it, you're going to miss out on a ton of blessings that God has for you? So I want to kind of tie this into something real. So I talked about this, that motivation is less than discipline. That discipline wins at all times. I want to paint a picture for you of one of the final conversations I had with one of my grandmothers. I was asking her about her Christian faith because she was one of the only people in my family. In fact, in my office, I have this big old giant coffee table-sized Bible that when she passed, one of my great uncles, who I'm not sure I've ever even met, sent me in the mail. He was like, it sounds like you might be one of the only people who will take care of this. So send it to me, which is kind of funny, kind of sad, but it's cool. So I remember having this conversation with her. I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, that she was a member of the Church of Christ, not to be confused with the United Church of Christ, which is literally the exact opposite of the Church of Christ. And I remember asking her, why are you a member of the Church of Christ? Not like being antagonistic, just why? And she told me something that struck me as like, whoa. She said, I didn't have a choice. I said, well, why wouldn't you have a choice? And she said, well, you got to understand. We grew up in a very poor family in the Midwest. They grew up in southern Missouri. My grandfather and my grandmother, they got married when they were 18 and 19. Grew up in northern Arkansas, southern Missouri, sharecropper parents, huge families. And she told me we had a family car, but it wasn't big enough for the whole family. That's not what it was used for. And so on Sundays, we would get dressed for church, and we would walk. And anyone want to guess how many churches were within walking distance? One. Okay, this is an entirely different world than we're living in, isn't it? Very different. So what would happen, just picture this for a minute, based on how we interact with faith and church. What would happen if you walked into that church and the preacher was terrible? Just, man, that was a stinker of a sermon. The guy just doesn't have any skills. How many of you would go home and say, well, I guess I'm not going to church anymore? There's only one, so that's my choice. I either go to that one or I don't go to one. See where I'm going with this? Or you walk in and you're like, oh no, they only do pipe organ and hymns? I'm over that. That's not how I connect with God. You see where I'm going with this? Do you want to know why I think in some regard we have an issue? Because we have things called like YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We have access to all of these things. And so, do you know what this has done? It's opened us up in a really cool way where we get to hear lots of voices and see lots of things. But if we're riding the cultural wave of motivation, guess what we have if we want it? We have an endless stream of quasi-motivation. And maybe we look past the part where we actually don't know who that person on the screen is or what their lives look like, and they certainly don't know who we are or know us by name. But they say really good punchlines, and they post to Instagram and little like phrases that I can repost, and so it makes me feel like fired up all the time. But I would say there is a warning in there that doesn't breed discipline. It breeds living by the next big thing. In youth ministry, there's a word for this. It's called the camp. Anyone? The camp high or the camp experience. Do you know how many teenagers want to be Christians and want to give their life to the Lord at camp? Almost all of them. Do you know how many of them walk it out every day from there on out? I would say maybe a quarter or less. Until camp starts next year, and then all of a sudden these kids come out of the woodwork. I haven't seen you, but your check and your paperwork came in. Back to it, right back up at the altar. I want to receive Jesus. I'm not poo-pooing it. I'm just saying it's a reality of when motivation is super high, we commit to things that maybe we don't have the discipline to walk it out. Does that make sense? So I think we're sometimes living in this world of we're looking for motivation. We literally have $1 billion+ industry of motivational speakers, right? If you are like me, I've been to a lot of Christian conferences, and I'm not poo-pooing it. I'm just telling you a reality and observation. Do you know what I've noticed about these? It's almost the same people at every single one. It's almost like we got a list of 30 people, and at every conference, we're just going to choose 10 of them, and it's the same speakers over and over and over, to the point where I'm like, I've already heard this message before, right? It's very interesting. And so what do we do? Do we just say, it's not for me, it doesn't give me any motivation? Or do we say, hey, I grew up in rural Southern Missouri, there's only one church. I don't necessarily care for the pastor, but that is sort of irrelevant because God has called us to gather together, and I am going to follow him. And one day, maybe, we'll get a new guy who's better at it, but until then, I'm going to go and I'm going to take notes and I'm going to learn whatever I can learn. And I'm going to embed myself in that community. I'm going to fellowship. I'm going to offer all that I have because that's what I'm called to do, whether it feels good or not. Are we on the same page? Okay. Many of you are nodding, but I also know it's the nod of like, oh yeah, I understand, but it's way easier to say than do. Would you agree? Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about what discipline looks like. If slothfulness looks like Wall-E that we watched, what does discipline look like? I immediately thought of a person, and before I tell you who it is, I did call them today and have a very good conversation and got permission. So if you're not like, whoa, Andy's just talking blatantly about a person we all know, and that's very awkward. How many of you know Taylor Huseman? Does anybody know Taylor? Okay, if you come to church on Sunday, Taylor is saxophone guy. I would encourage you to call him Lisa Simpson because that will irritate him, and I think it's funny. Or call it the clarinet or something. Okay, so I met Taylor a handful of years ago. He moved here from Iowa, and one of the first things I knew about him is that he was just good at everything. Anybody know Taylor good enough to know he's good at everything? And I'm not kidding. He's like concert-level saxophone guy, and that's like the fifth best thing that he's got going for him. He's like a world-class cyclist on a bike. How many of you know we watched the video? He broke a world record in the mile while pushing a stroller. Yeah, I can't remember the time. It was like 4:28 or something. He ran while pushing his daughter in a stroller. I was there. It was like miraculous. I've never seen a human being move that quickly. And all it was doing in me was like, I was like trying to suppress the jealousy of what on earth, how is that possible? Some other things about Taylor. He's really smart. He's very educated. And you start talking to him and you realize a lot of that intelligence has nothing to do with the college he went to. I remember the first time I found out that Taylor owns a couple homes. And it's not because somebody left him a lot of money. It's because he figured it out. He owns a couple businesses in Iowa, and he just commutes back and forth and takes care of them on the phone. And he's younger than me. How many of you would say this is always a problem when it comes to these things? If they're older than you, you're like, oh man, I can at least achieve that one day. That's the excuse. But when somebody's younger than you, it's like, ugh, why are you better at everything? Right? So this is where I'm going with this. I was sitting with Taylor in a group of people, and someone was probably feeling like I was feeling in some ways, but a little bit more bold to say something. And they said, wouldn't it be nice to be good at everything? To him. And he didn't take kindly to that. Do you know what he said? He said, how many hours a night do you watch Netflix? When you wake up in the morning, how long does it take you to get out of bed as you scroll on your cell phone? When you're driving in your car, how long do you just listen to random talk radio that puts nothing good in your mind? And he just started to lay out what he does. Sleeps probably more than most of you. He doesn't waste any of that time. He studies real estate and business, stuff he taught himself. He goes for a run. When he had kids, guess what? Oh, shoot, how do I work out and care for my children at the same time? I'll combine the two because it's important to me. Put his daughter in the stroller, started running, and then realized, I wonder if there's a world record for that. That's my goal, right? And so it was this discipline. Some other things I found out is he's a Star Wars fanatic. He just knows, like, he wins, like, Star Wars trivia competitions. Just like, what on earth? How do you know all? It's because there is not wasted time. When he is leisurely, he is very leisurely, right? How? It's a mirror onto ourselves that, yeah, we waste a lot of time. Even if we're not actively struggling with this habitual lifestyle of slothfulness, even if it's not like every day I just sit in a recliner, we do have these little things, and do you know what we do when we see somebody else without them? We get jealous and we make excuses instead of looking at ourselves and saying, I have the symptoms of this in my own life. And as a follower of Jesus, God wants to help us root those things out. But here's the problem, and this is the problem with all the sins we've talked about. The problem with this is that our culture says, it's okay. It's okay. You go to work, you work hard. You make an honest living, you provide good enough. It's okay. You should You should watch 3 hours of TV every night. You've earned it. Why not have a second beer? You've earned it, right? You work hard. And so what we do is we start to accept what the culture tells us, and these symptoms begin to take hold and grow in us. But the good news is that by the discipline that God has laid out for us, we don't have to swim downstream. Or we don't have to swim downstream slower than the current and pretend that we're fighting back. Do you know what I mean? We can make choices. We can really make choices. How many of you know weekly? I know a lot of phones do this. Tell you how long your screen time is per day. Anybody get that? I had to change mine because I was getting it on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. and it was like very much like, it's church, it's happy, my phone buzzed. What was it? Oh, man, that much this week? Like now I got another thing to repent of. So I changed mine. I think I get it on Friday now. How many of you know you spend a lot of time on there, and then it gives you the breakdown, how long you were on social media or gaming app or whatever, and you're like, there's no way that's possible. Oh, there it is, doesn't lie. So we get lost in these things. How many of you have ever been guilty of, like, you're watching YouTube, you go on YouTube to look for something, and then 3 hours later you're watching some random video? Danny and I were just talking about this. He was telling me I was watching a video, then all of a sudden I'm watching interactions from body cam footage of like a police officer in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm like, how did I get here? Because you click and you click and you click, and there goes all the time. And what could you be doing with that time? It's not a guilt trip of like, you should go get another degree. It's, God, how could I glorify you and honor you with my time? Maybe God's call to you, and what would be the most honoring is, hey, how about this? Why don't you go to bed? Because when you get a full night's sleep, you are such a gracious person. Maybe that's God's call to you. Maybe it's, hey, why don't you quit comparing and get a gym membership? Leave your phone behind and go in the morning. Maybe it's, hey, I got a lot to learn about the food that I'm buying and eating. I'm going to learn that. Maybe it's just learning a hobby, woodworking or skateboarding or something. Whatever it is, the question is not, what can I do to fill the time to get more productive? It's, God, how can I use this time to honor you, to glorify you, and grow into the person you created me to be? All right, so here's a list. I found this, I can't remember, Atrium. It's a compilation, I think, of 15 different studies. So they brought these studies together of people who were high in discipline, and they compiled them and came up with the 10 most common traits of people who are disciplined. You can look at the list, a couple things that I think are interesting. I think that disciplined people seem to be highly achieving, but they also, in my opinion, the people I know, also seem like they have more time than me. Have you ever noticed that? Disciplined people, you're like, oh yeah, it'd be nice, but do you have 2 kids? And they're like, no, I actually have 4. And you're like, what? Well, geez, that excuse goes out the window, right? Why? Because they organize and discipline their time in a way where they actually have more time, and disciplined people are not only high achieving, but they're also always learning something new. So these are usually people at their core who are humble people, which is interesting to me. These people set good boundaries. I was talking to Ricardo beforehand about a boundary I feel like God's put on my heart of saying, I know what I should commit to, and I know that if I only commit to certain things, then I'm going to knock them out of the park. I'm going to do them with excellence. But I also know there's only so much I can carry, so I'm learning to say no. I'm not going to commit to that, not because I don't want to, but because I want to do things with excellence, and I can't do everything with excellence. So I'm so sorry, I just have to say no. I thought that was interesting. I like these people are routined. A lot of these people do almost the same thing every day. We talked about this a couple weeks ago with solitude, that Jesus, it turns out, wakes up early in the morning before anyone else is awake, which is kind of an interesting insight into him. Take deadlines very seriously and delay gratification, which I think in psychology is the number one indicator of future success, is the ability to say, I'm going to say no to something gratifying in the short term because I know that it will benefit me even greater in the long term. Let's talk about discipline in the Bible, and then we will head for the finish line from there. Let's see. Do we want to do 1 Timothy or do we want to do Psalm 1? Let's take a democratic vote. Technically, we're not a democracy, though. We're a republic, just so you guys know. constitutional republic at that. Okay, who says 1 Timothy? All right. Who says Psalm 1? How many of you say I don't care? Not that you don't care, but you could do either one. Okay, I think 1 Timothy was the most. So let's talk about it. So let's set the stage. Timothy, who wrote 1 Timothy? And who did he write it to? Timothy. And what is the age difference? Lots. Decades, probably. Okay, so what is kind of the general tone of the letter? It's fatherly. But it's also, even though it's fatherly, it's not demeaning. It's not patronizing. It's, you can do it. In fact, I love 1 Timothy 2, I think, is don't let anyone look down on you because you're young. You carry authority, and you show them you carry authority not by your words or your strength, but by your life. I love that he says that. Set an example for the believers. So this is what he says to him. He says, have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness. You could put a circle or underline around that. This is interesting. Train. This is not like a choo-choo train. What kind of training is this? This is work out your spiritual muscles, right? And if you're going to train yourself, what does it mean to train? Oh, I got this really big spiritual battle coming. I better start cramming 2 days before it comes, right? I had a professor in seminary, he would pray before every class, but when we would have a big test, he would say, God, I pray that you would reveal the preparation of each student. That those who have prepared would do better than they thought, and those who thought they were going to skate by would be revealed for what they've done. Yeah. Yeah, which is funny because when I was in high school, before I knew God, I used to do the fake prayer of like, God, help me get an A. Like, God is not going to help you get an A. God gave you everything you need to set aside time, to commit, to study, to prepare well, and your refusal to do it, God is not in the business of just bailing you out for an A, right? Is that true, Steve, or do you just give A's? Do you ever pray, God, help me to just give the letter grade arbitrarily?
I just have a dartboard in my office.
No wonder your class is waitlisted. Okay, rather train yourself for godliness. Training is a process. Training takes time. Training requires a lot of elements. Let's just talk about like an Olympic, swimmer. What goes into that? Hours of hard work. What else? I guarantee you there are people who are very disciplined with their diet, right? I guarantee you these are people who sleep. These are people who are hydrated, right? How many of you know that emotional, heavy-duty things, maybe just conflict with somebody over and over, actually can take a physical toll on you? Yeah. These are people who are training, and it's not just in the thing that they're known for. It's their eating, their sleeping, they're doing all of these sorts of things. For while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life, but also for the life to come. So not only is there value right here, right now, it will help you to navigate life, that God with you will teach you and be your guide and your leader. If you submit to him, there's also an eternal reward. The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance. That's what Paul says to Timothy. Listen, Timothy, here's the deal. To be godly takes energy and it takes time and commitment, and it will be to your benefit here on earth and in heaven. And then he says, you could take this statement to the bank. This is one that is not up for interpretation. It means exactly what I said it means. It is it's fully trustworthy and deserving. For to this end we toil and strive, because we have our hope set on the living God, who is the Savior of all people, especially to those who believe. So here's what I want you to see. Hard work. Convenient? Sometimes, but usually not. Comfortable? I have been reading this book. It's about Eric Liddell. Has anybody seen the movie Chariots of Fire? It's about Eric Liddell. Basically, his entire story is just riddled with all the things people say that you can't do. You just can't do that. That's impossible. That's physically impossible. Nobody can run that fast. What's crazy is there was a time where there was literal like scientists at major universities saying, well, it's impossible for the human body to break 4 minutes in the mile, right? Some psychopaths hear that and they think, challenge accepted, right? Hard work, it's not always convenient. It's not always comfortable, and this is important. It's not always, and I would say it's usually not immediately gratifying. How many of you had this experience before? You're praying, and you're praying. Maybe you feel like God puts something like strange or weird on your heart, and you just carry it with you, and you're praying, and then like one random day someone says something, and you're like, oh, God put that on my heart. I know what that's there for. Sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes your muscles are sore. Sometimes you're exhausted, but you continue to press on, as Paul says, for the goal that's set before you. We're not going to have time for the theology of vocation, but I do want you to recognize, like we talked before, that work, worthwhile work that's pushing forward the kingdom of God as God intended, is ordained before sin enters the world. Work is not a curse, it's a blessing. Work might not be the job that you work 9 to 5. God has work for you. So do not underestimate that. If you want to flip the page, we'll wrap up here. This, in some regard, is born out of my conversation with Taylor, who I talked to you about. I just asked him, hey, what would you say to somebody? Here are some of the things. I wrote this, that discipline is an act of worship. Sometimes we think discipline and preparation are my preparation for when I can glorify God. But I want to tell you, everything can be done for God's glory. Everything can be worship. Everything. And so don't underestimate that just the discipline itself is your act of worship. Sometimes we think, man, I woke up at 5:30 because that crazy pastor told me I should try it, and I read my Bible, and I feel like I got nothing out of it. Well, maybe just getting up was your act of worship. It's possible. Be intentional. Plan ahead. Put it in your calendar. Put it in your calendar. Be honest with yourself. Maybe it's, I need to eat healthier. Maybe the honest, detailed truth is like, I'm going to get down to the nitty-gritty. I eat way too much sugar. I got to cut back on the sugar. Be honest with yourself about what it is. And then here's something Taylor told me. Be honest with someone else. Accountability will end up mattering. You might, in the short term, find some discipline in your life. In the long term, when it gets hard, it is very nice to have somebody who says, hey, you told me you were committing to that thing. How's that going? Well, thanks for reminding me and holding me accountable to that. This came from Taylor as well. He said if he was instructing someone who's trying to get physically fit, he said where I would start would just be a few minutes a day, and I would make a very small goal. Maybe it's I never exercise. Well, how about this? Let's get you walking a quarter of a mile. A quarter of a mile, the end of the block and back. That's the goal, and let's celebrate that as a success. We'll build off it, but let's just start small. Let's do something. Doing something is what we have to start with. He told me when he helps people with this, he says smaller goals usually quickly blossom into bigger ones as the person builds confidence. Maybe it's in your prayer life. I want to pray for 20 minutes a day, but I start praying, and I pray, and I pray, and I pray, and I pray all morning, then I look at my clock, and it's only been 7 minutes. I've done that before, right? Well, that's a heavy weight for a spiritual muscle to lift. Instead of that, let's just say 7 minutes is a success. I'm going to pray 7 minutes every day this week. Next week, I'm going for 8. And say, that's a success. I'm not going to get hard on myself. Consistency over intensity. I did a little number crunching. 40 minutes a day is only 2.8% of your day. So what if you worked out or prepped a meal or prayed or read your Bible 15 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes at lunch, and 15 minutes in the evening? Broken up, how many of you are intimidated by that? No, it looks easy. Consistency. Set yourself a goal that can be accomplished. Prepare yourself. This was his example. Hey, if you're going to say, I'm going to wake up at 5:30 and I'm going to go for a jog, how about this? Put out your shorts and your socks and your shoes. In your shirt, put it out. Put it out right by the door so that when you wake up, it's all I got to do is get out of bed, put the clothes on, go out the front door. Make it easy for yourself to get started. Push yourself. Don't be afraid to set a goal. Sometimes we're debilitated by like, man, I've tried this before and I've failed, and so I don't even want to set a goal because I'm going to feel like a failure. Just set a goal. Don't be afraid. Keep track. Small improvements are worth being excited about. I recently was talking to a young person who told me, hey, I finished the Gospel of Matthew. And I was like, awesome. And he's like, remember we talked about it? And I was like, I don't remember that. Well, it was like probably almost 2 years ago, but I did finish. And, in that moment, because I know this person, I realized this is a huge success. This is not a failure. This is an enormous success. I want to celebrate with you, right? If I knew you as somebody who reads the Bible every day and you're like, hey, I kind of stopped, but I did read, Ephesians over the last year, I would say, like, let's set your goals a little higher. So everybody is different. And then I think the most important thing is remember who God is. How many of you are hard on yourself? How many of you do things and you know that other people might see them as a success, but you could still pick out the things that you feel like, man, I blew it. I could have done that better. How many of you are nitpicky? For the longest time, until like the last 18 months, I would never dare watch a sermon of myself. I just wouldn't. Because I would do that like so bad I couldn't even get through 10 minutes. I would just blast myself. I feel like I've been challenged. Remember who God is. I just wrote some words here. God is graceful. God is forgiving. God is gentle. I shared this in a sermon once, and this is what I'll end with. I can remember when Colton was like 10 months old. Jimmy Reeves had given me a hat of his company, Cornerstone Construction. And Colton, he wanted that hat so bad. He would buy it on the bill, the brim. He would chew it until it was just a sloppy, nasty mess. But he loved that hat. He wanted it more than anything. And I remember I'd put him on the ground, and he would do this crazy thing where he would lay on his belly, and he would just dance like this. And we were trying to get him like, why won't he crawl? Why won't he crawl? Why won't he crawl? He's not doing any crawling. And I remember I just put the hat like less than a foot away from his outstretched arms, and he locked his eyes on it. He put his arms out and his elbows down, and he just went like this and grabbed it. And I remember in that moment, I didn't say, seriously, that's all you got? I didn't say that. Because I knew what a 10-month-old is and what he's capable of and what he's not. And what was my reaction? Yeah, now we're moving, right? Sometimes we think of ourselves as epic failures. We think we're blowing it. We're disappointing God. And I think sometimes we need to pause and remember who God is. God is the God of grace and forgiveness. God is the one in the prodigal. What is the figure whose God does? What does he do? He runs in celebration. You're back. Yeah, but I blew everything. I'm a total failure. Yeah, but you're back. Let's celebrate, right? Remember who God is, especially as you're pursuing spiritual discipline, because sometimes we can compare ourselves to others. By the way, others have a tendency to beef up what they actually do. If you just really talk honestly with people, you're probably under the assumption like, oh my gosh, that person, he's a deacon. I bet he reads the Bible 4 hours a day and prays into the night. And we build up these stories, and then we compare ourselves to a story that's not even reality. I think that's where we'll end tonight. Let me pray for you, and then we'll dismiss. You're free to linger and hang out, chat. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Again, if you want to help with side salad or dessert, we'd be really grateful for our potluck. You can come see me or Kay or Linda in the back. God, thank you that when you call us into relationship with you, that you don't just leave us high and dry. We're not just left to our own devices, but you've given us tools, you've given us calling, you've given us mission in our lives that we can partner with you. So God, we're grateful for it. I feel deeply that we all just need to pause and recognize the gifts of God in us. We're diverse, yet we're unified, and we all bring something to the table. And so God, as we begin to maybe revisit some of the ways that we've wasted some of those things, you're not holding that against us. You're inviting us open-handedly to join you right here and right now. So God, I pray that you would put things on people's hearts, that they would use their gifts and their resources and the things that you've given them to further your mission, to further your kingdom in the world. We want to be people who reflect you to our workplaces and our families and our friends and everywhere we go. And so, God, I pray that you would give us the boldness and the courage. Would we not sidestep things and make excuses? Would we own them? Would we ask for forgiveness often as we stumble and fall? And would we get back up and do the things that you've called us to do? So we love you and we want to pursue discipline this week and beyond. So help us to do exactly that. Amen.